can see where we are Zooming from in our houses. We're streaming live at facebook.com/KUOW Public Radio and on YouTube at youtube.com/user/KUOW 949. Okay, so let's start the show today with what we all learned last night. Federal agents have landed here in Seattle, and here's what Mayor Jenny Durkan had to say at a press conference this morning.
I can't overstate it enough. What is happening is frightening to me. Seeing the type of escalation that has happened in Portland night after night is not good for America. It's not good for any city.
Now, until last night, the message Durkan and Governor Inslee said they were getting from the federal government was, we're not sending any agents to Seattle. This all sounded, to really kind of understate it, confusing, unclear. Jasmine, what did you think about the news last night that agents have landed in Seattle?
Yeah, I think it's very concerning, especially after seeing what has happened over the past week in Portland, where federal agents have really escalated a lot of the conflicts between protesters and law enforcement. So hearing that federal agents are now in Seattle, and we're not sure how many, we're not sure where, it's a real cause for concern with the safety of the protesters on the ground.
Monica, some of the reporting on this says that agents are supposed to be on standby. And that was for later. Oh well.
That was scary.
I know. I was a little frightened by that too. We'll talk about that later though. So some of the reporting that I saw said that these agents are supposed to be on standby. If you're watching us on Zoom, you can see I'm scare quoting standby. Do you think that distinction means anything? Standby?
I don't. I know that they've been sent to cities under this guise of protecting federal buildings and monuments. But if you look at the chain of events that led to this moment, the Trump administration has been saying very explicitly that they intend to get tough on cities, that if these protests don't get under control, then they're going to send federal agents to cities to essentially intimidate. And I think that that's very much the reason for why they've been sent. And that's clearly what we're seeing play out in Portland.
Carolyn, you said that all of this reeks of election year politics to you. What do you mean by that?
So what I mean by that is that I think that this is a gambit by the Trump administration. One of their appears to be many Hail Marys to get to rile up tensions between people who are either protesters or who might be there to intentionally cause destruction, as there is a clear distinction, but I'm not going to go into that. And the feds or other law enforcement, so that Trump can create drama and a distraction from his administration's failed response to the pandemic. Honestly, if he can project the idea that he brings law to what he claims are lawless citizens and cities and situations, then he can set himself up as the law and order candidate he's always wanted to be seen as, particularly since he's been so roundly criticized by all but his most loyal supporters, who basically see him as the second coming for whatever reason.
Right. And I think that's a really interesting point too, because it's largely not worked, right? It hasn't intimidated protesters from leaving. And in fact, it's really galvanized more people to come out and different people to come out, right? Like in Portland, we saw moms and dads, at the front line, linking arms, singing lullabies, using leaf blowers to blow back tear gas. So it's definitely created a lot of drama for sure. But I think if anything, it's kind of strengthened the resolve of the people who are down there on the streets, for the past 2 months.
Well, Jasmine, I'm sorry, Carolyn, go ahead.
Oh, sorry. All I was going to say was that, to me, I agree. It hasn't worked in the eyes of us.
Right.
But in the eyes of conservative white America, he is doing exactly what he promised, which is basically beating down what he is labeling as a threat to security and America. Mm-hmm. And so in that vein, it serves to further divide the country, which is what he wants. He wants to scrape up as many votes as he can get, including those of conservatives who are potentially waffling on whether or not they want to vote for him, given how horribly his administration has responded to, particularly to the pandemic and to ensuing protests.
I want to talk a little bit about local law enforcement here, though. As Jasmine, as you pointed out, these agents have already been in Portland for a while. They've been taking people off the streets, taking them away in unmarked vans. Just in the last week or so, they broke a Navy veteran's hand, they punched a journalist in the head, and they tear gassed the mayor and police commissioner of Portland, Ted Wheeler, who had himself been using tear gas on protesters.
Makes me think long and hard about whether this is really a viable tool. I want to look at other options. This is not a good option.
But you're not sure even after being.
Well, I hate it, and I've said that before. The answer is yes. I would absolutely consider it. I have an honest. I'm not sitting here thinking, gee, what am I going to do next? Right now, I'm thinking about my runny nose, my runny eyes, and my lungs. But it definitely is. It's not a good tactic. It's indiscriminate. I mean, there's a lot of people hanging out here who are not doing anything wrong.
Okay, so Mayor Wheeler had a change of heart about tear gas, or he's starting to have a change of heart about tear gas, it sounds like. What do we think about this? Jasmine, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting. And I was awake watching that kind of unfold on Twitter. And it's an incredible image to see the mayor of a major American city get tear gassed by federal agents. But at the same time, that was the first time that Wheeler was on the ground in almost 60 days of protests. He, kind of skirted banning tear gas back in June. So I think there's this real tension between, the rhetoric of him showing up and getting tear gassed and that image and how it gets, broadcast to the world at large, and the real situation on the ground, which is that to many protesters, he hasn't really done enough to stop the kind of escalation tactics of both the Portland Police Bureau and the federal agents. And I think that's also echoed here in Seattle as well, where, this morning and yesterday, we heard a lot from Mayor Jeannie Durkin condemning federal agents being sent to Seattle. But, just earlier this week, she and Carmen Best, Police Chief Carmen Best, were asking to put a hold on the tear gas ban and less lethal munitions ban that was voted on by the city council that is going into effect this weekend.
Monica, one of the questions you had about this is whether it's even legal for federal agents to show up and act like law enforcement in cities and get in the way of local law enforcement and local jurisdiction. This is obviously a question a lot of people have. There's a legal challenge happening in Portland right now. But I mean, my question really is, does the legality of these actions even matter? I mean, I don't know if it follows that if it's illegal, that means it will stop. What do you think about that?
I think there are two things that are going on here at the same time. One is this sort of constitutional question of what it means for federal agents and local law enforcement and local officials to be in violent conflict with one another. And that is a really interesting reflection of the moment we're in right now. But I think from the perspective of the protesters who have been in the street for weeks, the question is about how we do law enforcement broadly in this country and whether it's ever acceptable for people who are paid with our tax dollars, who are at the orders of our elected officials, to use weapons on citizens. And I think from that perspective, it kind of doesn't really matter whether it's a federal or a state or a city official who's wielding the weapons themselves.
So do you think that this means we're looking at a potential change in how law enforcement interacts with protesters? I mean, we have one head of a local law enforcement agency saying, maybe I shouldn't use tear gas. That was really uncomfortable. I mean, are we going to see more changes like this moving forward as this continues? What do you think, Carolyn?
I'm not sure. I think that it's easy to say in the moment because you don't like getting tear gassed. Nobody likes getting tear gassed. But then to be swayed one way or the other by differing political opinions once you're out of that situation is a very likely possibility. And I think what's also interesting, what I also want to remark on, was Chief Best's talking today about the order from, I don't think I'm phrasing that correctly, but from the city council that goes into effect this weekend that says SPD can't use less lethal weapons, so they're going to have to put nightsticks essentially on their belts. She in fact said something along the lines of, "I'm going to replace this pepper spray with a nightstick." And it's like, well, that's very interesting to me that we're still not having that. Officials aren't really making the connection between having conversations of how to actually deal with large scale incidents or potentially volatile situations without immediately going straight to use of force in some capacity, whether that be through lethal weapons or through the use of literal batons. And I think that that's a really important step with regards to de-escalation training in general, not just with, are we going to keep using these less lethal weapons or not?
That's a question we're going to have to keep looking at as this continues. I wanted to move and talk a little bit about what's happening at the state level with coronavirus response now. I mean, one of the things we don't know yet is how involved Governor Inslee will be with the arrival of these federal agents here in Seattle. But we do know that obviously the governor's office is watching the state's coronavirus transmission numbers very, very closely. Just this week, he announced a rollback of parts of the state's reopening plan, including restrictions on weddings, funerals, restaurants, bars, and gyms. This, of course, comes after watching our positive case number continue to rise over the last several weeks. And in the end, Inslee says it comes down to needing less contact in general with each other.
We know that fewer, shorter, and safer interactions are absolutely crucial in this fight. We know that staying home is the safest, but if you go out, we need to keep it quick, we need to have distance, and we need to wear face coverings.
Carolyn, do you think that these rollbacks are restrictive enough to lower our overall transmission rate?
Absolutely not. And I've never been quiet about that. I don't think that Inslee is being tough enough, quite frankly. I think that he needs to actually commit and, actually bring down the hammer. I mean, clearly, as the data shows, these tiny little wrist slaps aren't doing it. And Washingtonians are clearly showing that they won't, quote unquote, do the right thing without any sort of actual penalty. I mean, not wearing a mask without a valid medical reason is the epitome of selfishness. And Inslee can't change that if he's going to continue to be kind and approach the matter with a fatherly response. Like, people are dying, businesses are going under, and inequities are widening. And it's an embarrassment that these people who refuse to wear masks could actually stop all of this by literally putting pieces of cloth in front of their noses and mouths. It's not magic.
Monica, you've said that there might be an advantage to doing kind of a phased approach to this kind of rollback. What did you mean by that?
Well, I think there's an upside and a big downside. I mean, I think on the one hand, the kind of public health playbook says that you have to do things in stages to get the most buy-in, because it's too shocking for people to, one day be able to go about their daily lives and the next day not be able to do anything. But at this point, with where the numbers are, I think that the cat's kind of out of the bag. We've already had a full-on shutdown, and the risk here, I think, is kind of the worst of both worlds, where you can't get the outbreak under control, but you also can't reopen businesses. So you're just feeling the full weight of the health and economic crises at the same time.
Jasmine, when you think about these new restrictions, these new rollbacks, is that going to have any material effect in how you live your life at this point?
Well, I mean, up until this point, I think I've been pretty cautious about going out, just me personally, especially with restaurants and, walking around the city, going on my walks. You see so many people, still inside eating, and even if it's on the patio. And so, I mean, yeah, I think that it doesn't go far enough in terms of restricting what people are allowed to do. I think that, Washingtonians will do as much as the state allows. And right now, there's a lot of space for them to, go to restaurants, go to gyms, and, potentially transmit this virus.
Okay. I just have to ask, where are we with seeing people doing things like going into restaurants and walking around outside without a mask on? What kind of reaction are you having in your gut when you see those things? I could spend the remainder of this hour talking about my feelings about this, but I'm curious to know where the three of you are on this. Jasmine, what about you?
Yeah, I mean, I think that shame and judgment isn't like the best the best way to kind of get someone to do things, to encourage people to do things. But it definitely makes me super uneasy to see, a bunch of people, or the legal amount of people allowed inside of a restaurant, talking, eating with their mouth, without a cloth mask on. And I think a lot about how that could affect, service industry workers who, are more or less kind of forced to go off of unemployment and back to work, and, them getting exposed and potentially transmitting it to a bunch of other people as well. I'm not sure if the rollback, going to retail seems a little bit more safe to me in terms of how I, go about and live my daily life. But I'm definitely kind of, post Chaz and CHOP coverage, I'm definitely kind of packing in my life a lot more.
Carolyn, because of the magic of Zoom, I could watch your face when I asked that question. Where are you with your reaction when you see people perhaps not being as conservative with their actions, not wearing a mask, going into restaurants?
To be polite about it, it makes me very upset and angry, because at the end of the day, they're really, not only are they risking their own families' lives by their own choices and actions, but despite, say, restaurant workers' best efforts, despite potentially even grocery store owner or workers' best efforts, both of whom are considered essential workers, they're putting other people, these very people we rely on to keep our, to keep our very lives running, in danger. And that's not okay. It is selfish beyond measure and makes me extremely upset.
Well, I would be remiss if I didn't mention the other big news this week, and that is that it is most likely Seattle Public Schools will be all online, at least for a while this year. That's what Superintendent Denise Juneau recommended. This is a reversal of what she was saying previously of trying to do some in-person schooling. Of course, the school board still has to vote on this recommendation, but it seems likely that that's the road we're headed down. I mean, this is honestly the other thing I could spend the rest of the hour talking about. I have an 8-year-old. I have no idea how this is going to work come September. But the other thing, which we have just touched on a little bit, is kind of this ongoing uncertainty, right? I don't know how long online schooling will last. I don't know what it's going to look like. I had an idea in mid-March of how long this might last when we all went into a kind of lockdown. Monica, I wanted to ask you, I mean, when this all started in mid-March, what did you expect late July to look like? Did you think we would still be here?
I did not think we would still be here in late July, but it doesn't surprise me given the way that things have played out. You asked earlier about how it feels to see people not wearing masks, and I always try to kind of reserve my judgment more for systems than individuals, and it's hard to overstate how incoherent the national response has been to this crisis. I don't think we necessarily had to be where we are today, but we are here, and we have this impossible situation where parents who, in many cases, both parents have to work, also have their kids at home, and are expected to just set them up with a laptop all day, and then everyone can go about their lives. I mean, there's no support for that reality, and I think it's extremely difficult for a lot of parents right now who have no idea what they're going to do in the fall.
How are you thinking about the fall yourselves? We just have about a minute left, but Monica, have you given any thought to what your fall is going to look like?
I am going to be spending a lot of time at home, hopefully doing some camping, but yeah, we haven't really been going to restaurants. We're not, we're trying to stay sort of as phase 1-ish as we can within reason, and fortunate to have a comfortable place to live and the ability to do our jobs from home.
Yeah. Well, let's take a quick break here. When we come back, we're going to talk about the end of youth detention in King County, that announcement from King County Executive Dow Constantine. And we will also talk about Carolyn's reporting on Seattle police officers using precinct addresses to register to vote in Seattle. I'm Jeannie Yandel in for Bill Radke, and this is the Week in Review.
Support for KUOW comes from locally owned Mio Posto Pizzeria is now open for indoor and patio dining at their locations in the Mount Baker, Ravenna, Admiral, and Mercer Island neighborhoods. Mio Posto offers open flame pizzas, Italian shareable plates, cocktails, and more. Learn more at miopostopizza.com.
This is 94.9 KUOW, Seattle's NPR news station. Sound stories, sound voices. It is 66 degrees in Seattle. We're expecting a little bit of sun this afternoon, maybe some rain, and a high of 70. It's 12:28, and we return to KUOW's Week in Review.
This is the Week in Review. I'm Jeannie Yandel here with Geekwire's civic editor, Monica Nickelsburg, staff writer for The Stranger, Jasmyne Keimig, and freelance journalist with the South Seattle Emerald, Carolyn Bick. So, with Bill away on summer break, I've also been filling in, hosting The Record. And this week I sat down to talk with King County Executive Dow Constantine, and he had some news to share.
We will work toward entirely closing centralized youth detention at the Children and Families Justice Center by the end of 2025, as has been demanded by Black Lives Matter of Seattle and King County. I will also propose additional investments, programmatic investments, to help create more robust, safe, community-based solutions for the very difficult cases that remain on any day, 19 to 20 or 21 cases. They are not simple. They are difficult cases to find a safe, community-based alternative, but we're going to invest in that work. And with the cooperation now of the actors in the criminal legal system and with the community, I believe that we have the ability to do what few, if any, have done, which is to eliminate a central youth detention facility.
Okay, so in 5 years, we will no longer have a youth detention center. Does this seem plausible to you, Monica?
I think it's certainly plausible. I think it's plausible that it could be done in fewer than 5 years if there was the will behind it.
I agree.
Well.
Yeah.
Jasmyne, why do you think it could take less than 5 years?
Well, at least with the youth jail, I mean, there's under 21, or there's 19 to 21 people who are currently there. I think that, if they're really serious about making sure that there was no youth detention, that it wouldn't have to take 5 whole years to completely depopulate the jail.
Yeah.
Mm.
Carolyn, in that audio we just heard, Dow had a lot of we wills. We will work toward closing the detention center. We will invest in community-based solutions. We will cooperate with other groups. What's already been done to get the youth detention center closed, though?
So there's obviously been a lot of on-the-ground activism work. Groups like No New Youth Jail, everything like that. I know that, and I believe that Executive Constantine sat down with Black Lives Matter specifically to talk about this issue, and then came out with this statement. But there, as I just mentioned, there's been a lot of push to do this, and it does interest me that they're doing it now. And I don't think that's a coincidence. I do think that it is in conjunction with the national surge of Black Lives Matter. And I really hope that, within this 5-year span, they do continue to not only sit down with groups like Black Lives Matter, but also actually sit down with people who have been incarcerated in that jail and let them guide the conversation and decisions when it comes to not only, how to repurpose this building for good, for better use, but also as to how to wind things down and potentially, alternatives to youth incarceration.
Do you think that a 5-year timeline is a reasonable timeline for this, Carolyn?
So I think that, as I mentioned in my comments to you before, I think that part of the reason they have instituted this 5-year timeline is to give themselves enough time to not only wind down the detention or youth detention, but also do it against the backdrop of economic and health fallout from this global pandemic. Because if you think about it, they're going to have to be doing this at the same time they're dealing with all this other fallout. And so I think they want to give themselves enough time to appropriately do it, and while at the same time appropriately dealing with, as I just said, all this different fallout. Now, I hope that they can get it done earlier, but I do want them to get it done that in a way that ultimately doesn't totally undermine the goal of closing down the center or the youth detention.
Yeah. Jasmine, we also know that this isn't the only announcement that the King County executive made this week. We also know that he's talking about looking towards adult detention as well. What do we know about this?
Yeah, so it's the downtown prison is also announced on like a 5-year depopulation kind of timeline, and one of the reasons why they decided on this jail in particular is because it's decrepit, it's falling apart, and they're also similar kind of looking into moving to a more therapeutic model and eventually demolishing the building downtown. And Constantine has said that he doesn't plan on, adding more to the Kent Correctional Facility, and that he's really looking towards, more kind of therapeutic, more rehabilitation kind of programs for the people imprisoned downtown.
Well, we know that there are about 1,300 people currently in that jail downtown. Do we have any sense of what's going to happen to them over the course of this closure over the next 5 years?
Well, yeah, I think a part of it is about like rehabilitating them and kind of getting them reintegrated back into society.
I'm wondering, we have heard specifically calls for no new youth jail, that there be no space for detention in this new Children and Family Justice Center that the county has been building. What specific demands do activists still have here? Carolyn, do you know?
I can't tell you specifically, no, I'm sorry.
Okay, I'm wondering how, when I spoke with Dow Constantine last week, it wasn't clear how much conversation he'd been having with activists about meeting their demands. Jasmine, I'm wondering if you know what those conversations look like.
Yeah, I think a lot of, or some of the demands that they did have was also the end of electronic monitoring at home, which Constantine has not yet agreed to. And they're also calling for a sped up timeline, and also converting the youth jail back into like a community center, which I actually think is, there's a really good kind of opportunity because the youth jail is right kind of in the middle of, the Seattle to kind of make it into a place for like Black and brown youth to, have a space to do art, to kind of come together and to really build them up in that way, as opposed to just imprisoning them.
I'm wondering about the legality of this as well, whether Dow Constantine, as King County executive, has legal standing to commute sentences, to release prisoners, to close a correctional facility. I know we're not talking about literally just shutting the doors and then that's it. But I wonder what the legality of this entire situation is.
I don't know the answer to that specifically, but it seems like particularly with minors, there's a pretty broad spectrum of options within the legal system that you can use and how to respond to these kinds of situations. And I just think whether or not you think it is an ethically appropriate thing to do to put a minor in detention, for thinking about outcomes as a community and what we're trying to accomplish, there's no data to suggest that our communities are made safer through youth detention. In fact, there's significant data to suggest that once you start a young person on this path, and they'll be in and out of the justice system all of their lives. And it costs more than $140,000 to keep one young person in jail for a year. Think about how those resources could be used in other ways. If a family could have that money and then was able to be more involved with their children who are struggling, I'm not saying that we can necessarily do a one-for-one payment like that, but we are capable of thinking big, and the justice system is this way because of a series of choices we've made, not necessarily because it's ordained.
Well, this is not the only law enforcement story that we've been thinking about this week, the closing of the King County Detention Center and what that timeline looks like. Carolyn, you've been reporting on some Seattle Police Department officers and how they're registering to vote. Can you tell us a little bit more about that story?
Yeah, sure. So this is based on a tip, anonymous tip that I got last week. Yes, last week. It's been quite a week.
That basically meaningless now. It's fine.
Yeah. What day is it? But no, I got this tip last week, and it had been on my mind. And then on Monday, I had a tiny bit of downtime, so I'm like, I might as well call it King County elections, because I had looked up the information just to triple check in the Sound Politics voter database. And I noticed, obviously, that's only up to date as of April 1st, 2020. So I was like, I'm going to call this to verify, see if not only are they still registered at these precincts, but also to check about the legality for this, because I know there might be some question around that. And as it turns out, it's apparently illegal. And the story just kind of made itself, basically. And then yesterday, actually, I also confirmed that 2 more officers have done the same thing with the Seattle Police Athletic Association address.
So how many officers are we talking about total who live outside Seattle who have used either the precinct or the Athletic Association address to register to vote in Seattle?
So I can't speak to where they live. I think that that's a misunderstanding that a lot of people just kind of run with. I'm not saying, and there's no evidence so far to show that they actually live outside Seattle. However, they are using non-residential addresses to register to vote, and that breaks election law.
And
it's 8 of them. Sorry,
there's 8 of them, and one of them is the president of the Police Officers Guild, correct?
Yes, one of them is Solon. I keep calling him Solon. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing his last name correctly. It might be Solon. I apologize. But one of them is the Seattle Police Officers Guild president. And according to a small story KUOW did after my story came out, according to their story, he has been registered at the Seattle Police Department's South Precinct address for the last 16 years.
Doesn't the county follow up with voters after they register to see if the addresses are correct? I'm just wondering if there's any, process there to make sure that people aren't lying.
So this is part of the reason why Haley Watkins, the King County Elections comms officer who spoke with me and who had been so gracious as to continuously follow up with me over these stories, mentioned that this is why these alleged residential addresses, or just generally voting addresses, are made public so that voters can hold each other accountable, because there is no follow-up by King County Elections. And I do think, and this part is speculation, because I haven't confirmed this, but I do think that this has to do with people who are living unhoused, who can't necessarily stay at one address permanently, because if they had to, if they had to follow up as somebody who's unhoused who might legally be able to vote because they do live within Seattle, they might have moved, say, the cross streets they've registered or something like that. And so I do think it's difficult. It's a situation of you either apply to everybody or you apply to nobody. And I think that they're trying to be sensitive to that, but also, find a way to have folks held accountable, which, this has clearly done, at least for these 8 officers.
Monica, Jasmine, I feel like I frequently see concerns about voter fraud certainly at the national level. I'm wondering how each of you are thinking about this story, in terms of that larger national conversation we seem to be having.
Yeah, I mean, I think that President Trump, when he, denounces mail-in ballots and accuses it of, opening up the possibility of voter fraud, he's not talking about, police officers registering at their precincts. But I mean, I think that there's a very low incidence of fraud just in general with mail-in ballots. And I think it's something that is very equitable and accessible to people who can't get time off of work. And that this story to me really seemed like something that needed to be hashed out within SPD and should definitely be looked into by the appropriate authorities.
Monica, you've pointed out that the eyes of the nation are on Washington State when it comes to our mail-in ballot system. What's your thinking on how something like this might affect what they're seeing?
Right. I'm really concerned about this because overwhelmingly the evidence has showed that mail-in voting is a great way to make voting more equitable. It increases turnout, and it's a great solution right now when we are trying to figure out how to hold elections in a pandemic. But there is a contingent of folks in public office who want to cast it as, an opportunity for fraud, as untested, as dangerous. And I don't really believe the goal of that is to reduce voter fraud. I think it's to reduce voting. So to see people who are charged with upholding our laws violating this really basic law and really feeding into that argument that you can game the system, that there's no follow-up, that you can say that you live in Seattle and not really live there and vote there anyway, is a huge bummer, even if it is just because they don't want to disclose their personal address because they work in law enforcement. I think that of everyone in our system, they should be adhering to election rules and laws the most stringently.
Carolyn, you reported the story and you talked about how the county doesn't necessarily follow up with voters and the reasons why. Do you have any sense of whether these officers will be held accountable elsewhere, perhaps by the police department, perhaps by the Police Officers Guild?
I think that with enough pressure, they certainly will. I mean, if you don't let something die, it won't. I actually, about 10 minutes before the show started, I did receive an email from Dan Satterberg's office, the King County prosecutor, which I have yet to open. So I'm interested to see what they have to say. So basically, I think, again, if this continues to be looked into and again isn't allowed to die, then there will actually be follow-up. But I think that you really need to hold various groups feet to the fire, because sometimes unfortunately, as we've seen, officers are given a pass by people who consider them peers.
Dan Satterberg's mystery email aside, at this moment we don't know if measures, right? Sounds like we don't have an answer for that. Yeah. At 1 o'clock, you have to open the email, and then you have to let the three of us know what it is. I'm certainly curious. We're going to take a quick break here, and then when we come back, we're going to talk about tech giants making commitments to make their companies greener. We're also going to talk about the Climate Pledge Arena and the mysterious sea monster that will soon be playing within its walls. This is the Week in Review. I'm Jeannie Yandel.
Support for KUOW comes from Bill and Paula Clapp, who salute the 160 members of Global Washington who are addressing the COVID crisis in the developing world. Learn more about how to help at globalwa.org.
94.9 KUOW, Seattle's NPR news station. Sound stories, sound voices. It's 12:46. Weather forecast for this afternoon, partly sunny, a slight chance of rain, and a high of 70. Starting tomorrow, we're hitting a string of sunny, warm days in Seattle. Now we return to KUOW's Week in Review.
And you're back with the Week in Review from KUOW. I'm Jeannie Yandel in for Bill Radke, and I'm here with Carolyn Bick, freelance journalist with the South Seattle Emerald, Jasmyne Keimig, staff writer for The Stranger, and Geekwire civic editor Monica Nickelsburg. Okay, so let's talk about some other big commitments that have happened this week. So Apple and Microsoft have both announced huge efforts to go greener. Microsoft aims to be carbon negative in the next decade by 2030 and to remove its historical carbon emissions by 2050. Apple, on the same day, announced that by 2030, every device it sells will have a net zero carbon impact. And of course, as we all know, Amazon is so committed to its own climate pledge, it paid to name our new hockey stadium after that climate pledge. It's literally called Climate Pledge Arena. Monica, you described these announcements, this is a very descriptive, evocative way of describing it, as buckling your seatbelt as you're driving off a cliff. How so?
Well, we should say that these are huge investments, and we do need to celebrate when companies voluntarily make huge investments in sustainability. You can't ignore that. But I use that analogy because you definitely should buckle your seatbelt if you're going off a cliff, but it is kind of missing the point. We are paying back a carbon debt that we began racking up in the industrial age. And even if companies stopped emitting tomorrow completely, we would still be dealing with the fallout of this global climate catastrophe. And so I think that while these announcements are great, I'm a little worried about the carbon offset element of it. That, when you say you're going to remove the carbon that you've put into the atmosphere over time, what you're saying is you're going to do that through carbon offsets, like funding reforestation projects. And that, again, is better than nothing, definitely something we should do. But they've also been used to allow companies to continue to grow their emissions over time. And I just think that there's really no strategy too aggressive to deal with the crisis that we're in right now.
Carolyn, how much do you think these climate change efforts matter this late in the game?
I personally think that Monica said it perfectly. It's like buckling your seatbelt as you go for a cliff. That's an amazing analogy because, climate activists, environmental activists have been at this work for decades to get huge companies like this to actually acknowledge the damage they're doing and that they have done. And only now they suddenly are. And I think that that's a product, again, of the age we're in. While I think that their willingness finally to do something should be acknowledged, it shouldn't necessarily be praised because it's like, okay, but you could have done this 3 decades ago and you could have helped. That being said, I do think that it's important for us on the other side as responsible consumers to not be decrying these big companies' impact on the environment while simultaneously ordering over something that you don't need for overnight shipping on Amazon.
Jasmine, what do you think? Can we trust these pledges from big tech companies?
Yeah, I mean, I think I kind of echo both what Carolyn and Monica said. I think it's great to make these commitments, but it does seem interesting that they all kind of do it around the same time, right? That they're kind of relying on their competitors to help shape their policy as opposed to, seriously caring about the environment and caring about the future of our planet and their impact on it. And, all of those companies have a huge impact on our planet. So, I mean, I'm cautiously optimistic, but I think it's important that, as consumers, we also kind of keep our foot on their neck when it comes to really meeting these goals and being, aggressive about how they do it.
There's also another side of this, which is that, we're looking at companies to lead on this, and we probably shouldn't be.
Right.
It should not be up to the Microsofts of the world to set the standard for their competitors in this sort of arbitrary, like, we think our reputation will be hit if we don't do what Microsoft is doing kind of way. Because the argument is that another company could come along without that balance sheet or without those scruples and invent a new product that wins over consumers overnight and is terrible for the environment. And because they were able to gain an advantage by this, legal gray area where they can do that, they beat out the companies who uphold themselves to stronger ethics. So without the government, without policy creating a level playing field for the technology industry, we're also missing the point.
That's an interesting point. I hadn't thought about the fact that if there's not an incentive for everyone to do this instead of just run away trying to make money, what point is there really if everybody's not working together on this? Yeah. I also feel like I should point out that if we were to make a t-shirt from this episode of Week in Review, it would be we're buckling our seatbelts while driving off a cliff. I feel like it's a lot of things happening right now.
Yeah, it's very poetic. It's very poetic.
Yeah, it really is. But I do want to go back to Amazon's climate pledge, of course, here, because we have a stadium here in Seattle, now named after that Climate Pledge Arena. Have you heard that the stadium has a different nickname now already, even though nobody's played there yet? Like, I don't even think anybody has been inside yet. Have you heard this?
No.
Yes.
Yeah, Monica, do you want to tell us what it is?
Well, the Climate Pledge Arena just doesn't roll off the tongue quite as easily as the Crack House.
Oh, wow.
No. I know.
Oh,
Yeah.
no.
I was thinking of the greenhouse. That's the one that I've seen.
Well, with the Kraken as our new name, I think it's only a matter of time.
I know. I feel like we could spend a whole hour unpacking that. And
My favorite nickname for it, though, is an inconvenient roof.
I like that one.
Wow, really bringing back the early 2000s with that one.
It's a bit cerebral, but I like it.
Yeah.
Al Gore is like, yes.
Yeah, you got to run that past Al. Yeah.
That's amazing.
Mhm.
Okay. Well, as you already alluded to, Monica, we know the name of the team that will be playing inside Climate Pledge Arena or the greenhouse or an inconvenient roof, whatever we're deciding to call it. We have to add another tradition, which in the storied tradition of sports ball teams going way, way, way back, we have to add one more tradition to our new NHL team. We're going to use this audio at least once every hockey game.
Release the Kraken.
Remember that earlier in the show? There it is. Yep, I know. We're officially the Seattle Kraken. I mean, let's take a poll. I know. Woohoo! Let's take a poll here first, really quickly. Do any of you care about hockey?
I can't say that.
Small amount.
Yeah, I don't. I think I'm neutral about it. I don't dislike it. I don't love it.
Yeah.
Mhm.
My editor or my publisher Marcus, who's probably listening, is probably laughing right now because he knows that I hate all forms of sports ball, including hockey, which like hockey I hate less than things like football, but he's probably laughing right now because my knowledge of anything sports related stops at its name.
Fair enough. I mean, hockey's played with a puck, not a ball. That's literally the only thing I know about hockey is it's not played with a puck. So I just want to throw out there that as like an audio producer person, the silence that happened after I asked you all whether you care about hockey just spoke volumes. Everybody was just like,
I may not be a big hockey person, but I love naming things. I love uniforms. I love colors, and I love mystical creatures. So, or rather mythical, excuse me.
Yes.
So I was very excited to learn that we will be the Seattle Kraken. Well, there's no S. Kraken is also plural.
Okay. Yeah.
Which is, I think it's confusing because I thought it was the Krakens, but like the Seattle Rain and like the Seattle Storm, it's all singular, baby. Yeah.
That's fair, but also I feel like we should point out that rain can be singular or plural, right? And the storm comprises a whole bunch of things. There are many elements that go into the storm. So those both feel like they can represent a team. I know that because I also enjoy mythical creatures, like you only need one Kraken to really mess things up.
Right.
It's got tons of tentacles.
How do we all the tentacles. That's a really good point, Carolyn. Maybe the team members are the tentacles of the Kraken. How do we all feel about the, we all like words, the singular plural thing with the Kraken. How do we feel about this?
I mean, it's a name and it's there.
I think it's fun. I think it's interesting. I think it's gotten some criticism for kind of playing to, a certain like crowd of people who, aren't taking it seriously necessarily. But I don't know. I think it's fun. I thought it was going to be either the Seattle Freeze, which I think is really a missed opportunity. Or they had an advertisement that came out right before the announcement, and a lot of people at the Stranger thought we were going to be the Seattle Washington State Ferry team, just because there was an interesting jump shot in the trailer, but we were proven wrong, clearly.
I remember that. I mean,
Yeah.
you know, the team, the Kraken, was kind enough to explain their logo, which seems suitably dramatic for a creature that was featured in both the 1981 movie, The Clash of the Titans.
Classic.
Yes.
My mom made me watch that. It's so good.
Yes. And also, of course, the much more recent movie, Pirates of the Caribbean. Wow, listen to that drama. Okay, so I'm going to read a quote from some of the hype around this. Okay, Seattle is a city built by the sea. Our forebears' hands cracked in the cold, salty air as they reeled in their lines and wrought their ships. Oh, the drama music ended. That's okay. It's back. This is a wonderful time to talk about another tradition that another hockey team has that's kind of related to the Kraken. So the Detroit Red Wings, do you all know about this? They throw dead octopuses or maybe octopi. You know about this, Monica?
I do, yeah.
Yeah, they throw dead octopuses onto the rink every time the Red Wings go to the playoffs. In one game, they threw 36 separate octopus carcasses. I have feelings about that, but I'm wondering, what should we throw on the ice to the Seattle Kraken? What are you thinking? Squid ink pasta? I don't know. What do you think?
Yeah, I was going to suggest, squid ink pasta, since I think the Kraken is loosely a descendant or a cousin to the squid, or a bottle of rum. There's the Kraken rum. It also kind of fits in with a kind of pirate's booty atmosphere, and, rum's great.
Yeah. Well, we only have about 30 seconds left. So I'm going to say, if you have any thoughts for what we should throw on the ice to the Kraken, please drop it in the chat of this Zoom meeting and we will share it with everyone later. But for now, I want to thank you all for joining me for the Week in Review. My panel this week is staff writer Jasmyne Keimig, Geekwire's civic editor Monica Nickelsburg, and reporter for the South Seattle Emerald, Carolyn Bick. Thank you all so much. Our show is produced by Sarah Leibovitz. Our live stream online is brought to you by Juan Pablo Chiquiza and Tio Popescu. Have a great weekend. We'll see you on Monday.